Everyone called him a monster. But when a young woman named Nalin reached through the darkness and took his scarred hand in hers, she saw something no one else could see. She saw the man beneath the ruins of his face, the gentle soul trapped inside a body that terrified children and made warriors look away. What happened next would transform not just one life, but the fate of an entire people standing on the edge of destruction in the unforgiving landscape of Arizona Territory, 1885. The words monster and Tocala had become inseparable, two halves of the same whispered curse that followed him through the Chiricahua Apache camps like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. Standing nearly 7 feet tall with a face torn open by a mountain lion when he was barely 7 years old, he existed in the spaces between belonging and exile, neither fully part of his people nor entirely separate from them. The scars that mapped his features told a story of survival that no one wanted to hear. 3 jagged lines carved from temple to jaw where the puma's claws had tried to peel back his face. The flesh puckered and twisted, his nose broken and healed crooked, his mouth pulled into a permanent half-snarl. But it was his unnatural height that truly frightened them, his massive frame that made grown warriors feel small and vulnerable. Some whispered he wasn't fully human, that his mother had lain with a mountain spirit, that his birth during a blood moon marked him as cursed. The old women spat protective symbols in the dust when his shadow fell across their path. Children cried and hid behind their mother's skirts. Even the dogs would growl and back away, hackles raised, sensing something that set their instincts screaming danger. Tocala had learned early that his very existence caused discomfort, that his presence was a weight people couldn't bear, and so he had made himself as invisible as a 7-foot giant could possibly be. For years he lived in the high country of the Sierra Madre, sleeping in caves that smelled of limestone and bear musk, eating alone, speaking to no one but the wind that howled through the canyons. He would approach the communal fires only in the deepest part of night, when shadows could soften his silhouette, leaving bundles of firewood and animal pelts near the camp, and retreating before dawn could expose him. He took only what he needed to survive, salt and cornmeal and the occasional knife blade, leaving his offerings in places where he wouldn't have to see the relief on faces when people realized he wasn't staying. What his people didn't know was that Tocala wasn't entirely alone in his mountain exile. Over the years, he had found wounded wolves, animals cast out from their packs for being too injured or too aggressive to keep up. He had nursed them back to health with a gentleness that would have shocked anyone who called him monster. These 3 wolves followed him like shadows, slept at the mouth of his cave, hunted beside him. They were his only family, the only creatures who didn't flinch at his approach. Sometimes late at night when loneliness sat heavy on his chest, he would howl with them, and in those moments he felt less like a monster, and more like just another wounded thing trying to survive. Tocala carried secrets even he didn't fully understand. His father, killed in a cavalry ambush before Tocala's 5th winter, had told the midwife something strange on the night of the boy's birth. The child had come into the world during a total lunar eclipse, during that rare celestial event, when Earth's shadow swallows the moon and turns it the color of rust. The elders interpreted this as a sign, though they couldn't agree whether it meant destruction or salvation. Some claimed he was the reincarnation of an ancient warrior spirit too powerful for normal human form. Others said he was touched by the thunder beings, those supernatural entities that rode storm clouds and struck down those who offended the natural order. The cycle of isolation shattered during a gathering near the Gila River, where several clans assembled to discuss the growing threat of the Bluecoats, the cavalry soldiers pushing deeper into Apache territory. The air was thick with smoke from cooking fires and the rhythmic pulse of drums, with the sharp smell of sage and sweetgrass, with tension that crackled like lightning about to strike. Men spoke in grave voices about treaties broken and lands stolen, about whether to fight or flee or negotiate with white soldiers who saw all Apache as hostiles. Tocala stood at the very edge of the gathering. So far back he was almost invisible in darkness beyond the firelight. He had come because runners said this meeting concerned the survival of all Apache people. But he kept to the shadows as always, his massive frame hunched as if he could somehow fold himself into something less threatening. He watched speakers gesture at the fire, watched women move between lodges with water and food, watched children play their games in the dust, and felt the familiar ache of being separate from it all, an observer of life rather than a participant. That was when Nalin did the unthinkable. She was known among her people as different, someone who saw things others couldn't. Women came to her with dreams needing interpretation, and she would speak of symbols and meanings with a certainty that made even elders listen. She was perhaps 25 winters old, with a face that held both softness and steel, with hands that had pulled children into the world and prepared the dead for burial, with eyes that seemed to look through the surface of things to whatever truth lay beneath. People respected her, but kept cautious distance because those who see too much are never entirely comfortable to be around. For 3 nights before this gathering, Nalin had dreamed the same dream. In it she saw flames consuming camps, saw soldiers advancing like an unstoppable tide, saw her people scattered and broken. And in each dream, standing between destruction and survival, she saw a massive figure with a ruined face, arms spread wide like a shield. She saw him not as the monster others claimed, but as their salvation, the answer to a question no one had thought to ask. While others spoke of war and treaties, while drums beat their ancient rhythms, Nalin walked away from the fire into the darkness where Tokala stood frozen in disbelief. She didn't avert her eyes from his scars. She didn't hesitate or show fear. She simply extended her hand and spoke in a voice that carried equal parts challenge and invitation. She asked him to join the social dance, the traditional gathering where people moved together in celebration of community. It was an act so shocking that conversation died around the fire. Warriors stopped mid-gesture. Children stopped their games to stare. She spoke so only he could hear, her voice low but firm, telling him she had dreamed of him, that the spirits had shown her he wasn't a curse but an answer, that he had been marked not for destruction but for protection. She told him she saw past the surface to what lay beneath, and what she saw wasn't a monster, but a man who had survived when others would have broken, who had chosen to stay gentle when he could have become the violent thing they all feared. Tokala stood paralyzed, his mind unable to process what was happening. No one had touched him voluntarily in more years than he could count. No one had looked at him without fear or disgust. And here was this woman, this seer, offering her hand as if he were just another man, as if his size and scars meant nothing. His first instinct was to flee, to disappear back into mountains where things made sense. But something in her eyes held him, some mixture of determination and understanding that suggested she knew exactly what she was asking and why. He took her hand. The touch sent electricity through his arm, a sensation so foreign and overwhelming he nearly pulled away. Her hand was small in his, delicate as a bird, yet her grip was firm enough to ground him. Together they moved toward the dancing circle, and every eye followed them. The drums continued, but singers faltered, unsure whether to keep going. An elder raised his hand to object, but Nalin cut him off with a look that said this was between her and the spirits. They danced. Tokala moved with the careful heaviness of someone who has spent years trying not to break things, who sees his own body as a weapon that must be constantly controlled. Nalin flowed like water, smooth and certain, anchoring him to the rhythm. For the first time in a decade, someone was touching him without cringing, looking at him without fear. It was terrifying and exhilarating and confusing all at once. Other dancers gave them wide berth, but no one stopped them. Nalin had opened a door everyone thought was permanently sealed. Watching from the edge was Jedediah Miller, a white scout who worked for the nearby military fort. Miller was complicated, the kind who had spent enough time among Apache to respect their skills while still carrying casual racism, who could admire their tracking abilities while referring to them as savages. He watched Tokala and Nalin dance with narrowed eyes, and something like recognition flickered across his weathered face. He had seen Tokala before, years ago, and he knew things about the giant's origins that others didn't, secrets that could shatter whatever fragile acceptance was building. The dance ended, and Tokala retreated to shadows, but something had changed. Nalin had cracked open a door to possibility he hadn't dared imagine. Over following days, she sought him out at the edges of things, brought him food, sat with him in comfortable silence. She told him about her visions, about the role she believed he was meant to play. She didn't try to fix or change him. She simply saw him, really saw him, and didn't look away. But peace was fragile in Arizona territory in 1885, and truth had a way of destroying even carefully built hope. Before we continue, I'm really curious. Where are you watching this from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories reach. And if you're finding value in this story, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps me keep sharing these experiences with all of you. The revelation came during a forced visit to the military fort, one of those tense negotiations over supplies and land use. Tokala stayed back as usual, waiting at the edge of the compound while designated speakers did their work. But Jedediah Miller, drunk on cheap whiskey and bitter about some perceived slight, started talking to soldiers about the giant Apache who had dared show his face at the tribal gathering. Miller's words carried across the dusty fort yard, loud enough for Apache and soldier alike to hear. He told them how he'd been there years ago when they found the baby, when a young Apache woman had returned to her people after months of captivity with white settlers. She'd been pregnant, and when the baby was born, it was clear the father wasn't Apache. The child had been huge even then, had features marking him as half-white, had the blood of a European giant running in his veins. Miller claimed the father was Magnus Eriksson, a Swedish settler known for his massive size and his brutal treatment of native women, a man who took what he wanted and left destroyed lives in his wake. The news spread like wildfire. Tokala heard it from 3 different sources before sunset, each telling confirming what he'd never known, never suspected. He was the product of violence, the son of rape, carrying the blood of a man who had terrorized the borderlands with casual cruelty. It explained his size, but it also added another layer to his rejection. He wasn't just physically monstrous in appearance. He was genetically impure in the eyes of traditionalists, contaminated by the blood of those who were destroying Apache lands. The discovery hit him like a physical blow. He retreated to his cave in the mountains and stayed there for 3 days, not eating, barely sleeping, his wolves pressing close as if they could sense his anguish. Everything he thought he knew about himself had been a lie. His mother, who had died when he was young, had carried this terrible secret. His father, the man who raised him knowing he wasn't blood, had loved him anyway and never told him the truth. And now that truth was out in the open, poisoning whatever small acceptance he'd begun to build. Nalin found him on the 4th day. She climbed up to his cave despite the difficult terrain, despite the warnings from others that the giant might be dangerous in his current state. She found him sitting at the cave mouth staring out at nothing, his wolves arranged around him like guards. She sat beside him without speaking for a long time. Finally, she said what everyone else seemed unable to say. So what? He didn't choose his birth, but every day since then, he had chosen to be good. Didn't that count for something? She told him about a vision she'd had the night before, about how she saw him standing between 2 worlds, belonging fully to neither but needed by both. She said the spirits had shown her that his mixed blood wasn't a curse, but a gift, that he would be able to speak to both Apache and white in ways others couldn't. Tokala wanted to believe her, but the weight of revelation sat heavy on his shoulders. He told her it would be easier if she just let him go, let him disappear into the mountains permanently. He said she deserved someone whole, someone whose very existence wasn't built on violence and shame. But Nalin refused to accept that. She took his massive scarred hand in both of hers and told him that wholeness wasn't about perfection. It was about choosing to keep going despite the breaks. But the revelation had consequences beyond Tokala's personal anguish. The news reached Magnus Eriksson himself, now an old man who controlled much of the trade in the region. When he heard rumors about a giant Apache, about a massive half-breed living in the mountains, something clicked in his diseased mind. He was dying from a rare illness, his body failing despite all his wealth and power. In his desperation, he began to believe that his son's blood might hold some cure, some genetic key to healing. It wasn't fatherly love that motivated him, but pure, selfish survival instinct. Magnus sent men to investigate, and when they confirmed the giant's existence, he sent more men to bring Tokala to him. Not gently, not with any attempt at reconciliation, but as if Tokala were property to be collected. These men were led by Silas Vance, a cruel enforcer who enjoyed causing pain, who saw the job of capturing a half-breed as entertaining sport. But Magnus made a critical error in his planning. He assumed Tokala would be easy to capture because he was a loner, because he had no allies, because monsters don't have friends who would fight for them. What Magnus didn't account for was Nalin. Vance and his men grabbed Nalin at a dusty trading post where she'd gone to exchange herbs for supplies. They knew from watching that she and the giant had formed some kind of bond, and they planned to use her as bait. Vance sent word through various channels that, if the giant wanted to see his woman alive again, he would come to Magnus Eriksson's fortified ranch voluntarily. Otherwise, they would hurt her, slowly, until there wasn't enough left to save. When Tokala learned of the kidnapping, he faced the hardest decision of his life. He could run, could disappear into the mountains as he'd always done, could live safely in solitude. Or he could do what he'd never done before, fight not as a monster hiding in shadows, but as a man defending what he loved. He chose to fight. With his 3 wolves at his side, Tokala approached Magnus Eriksson's ranch on a moonless night. The place was built like a fortress, high walls and armed guards built to withstand Apache raids. But Tokala wasn't raiding, he was rescuing. And there's a difference in the fury that drives those two things. He moved through the darkness like the specter people always feared he was. His massive size actually an advantage now. His strength no longer something to hide, but something to unleash. The battle was brutal. Guards saw his shadow and fired blindly into the dark, but Tokala was already moving, already past their lines. His wolves took down sentries silently, throats torn out before they could raise alarm. Tokala moved through the compound with focused rage, knocking men unconscious with single blows, breaking bones with his bare hands. A decade of restrained power finally released. He wasn't trying to kill anyone, but he wasn't being gentle either. These men had taken Nalin. They would pay for that. He found her in a locked room in the main house, chained to a support beam, bruised but defiant. When she saw him crash through the door, something like relief and love and vindication crossed her face. He broke her chains as easily as snapping twigs and lifted her into his arms. But before they could escape, a rasping voice called out from deeper in the house. Magnus Eriksson was in a bedroom filled with medical equipment that looked almost medieval. Tubes and bottles and strange contraptions meant to keep a dying man alive a little longer. He was propped up in bed, a shrunken version of the giant he'd once been. His flesh hanging loose on bones, his breath coming in wet rattles. When he saw Tokala standing in the doorway, genuine desperation filled his rheumy eyes. He called Tokala son, which was obscene coming from his mouth. He said he needed him, that his blood could save him, that surely Tokala wouldn't let his own father die when he had the power to prevent it. He promised wealth, land, anything Tokala wanted if he would just give some blood for testing. Tokala stood there holding Nalin, looking at the man responsible for his existence, for his mother's trauma, for all the pain that had radiated out from one act of violence 27 years ago. He could kill Magnus with one hand, could snap his neck and be done with it. Part of him wanted to, but a larger part, the part that Nalin had seen and believed in, refused. He told Magnus he didn't deserve his blood, didn't deserve anything from him. But he also said he wouldn't be the monster Magnus was. He would walk away and let Magnus face his death alone, surrounded by all the wealth and power that couldn't save him. It was a different kind of mercy, cold, but clean. Tokala carried Nalin out of that house and left Magnus Eriksson to die in his bed, calling out for a son who owed him nothing. Getting back to Apache territory was harder than leaving it had been. Tokala had violated treaties by attacking the ranch, had created an incident that the Bluecoats couldn't ignore. When he and Nalin returned to the camps, they found the elders waiting, faces grim. The cavalry was demanding Tokala's head as punishment for the raid. The clan was divided. some seeing him as a hero who rescued one of their women, others seeing him as a threat who brought more military attention. Nalin spoke before the council with a passion that surprised even those who knew her. She revealed her visions publicly, telling of dreams where she saw Tokala standing between their people and destruction, saw him as the bridge between worlds that could save them. The elders, who respected the visions of seers even when they didn't like what those visions showed, listened carefully. After hours of debate, they reached a compromise. Tokala would be exiled for 1 year and 1 day. If he returned still being hunted by soldiers, he would be permanently banished to protect the clan. But if he returned in peace, if the military no longer sought his head, he would be accepted as a full member of the clan with all rights and protections. It was a gamble, a test, a chance. Nalin refused to let him go alone. She declared she would follow him into exile, would share whatever hardship came. The elders could banish her too if they chose. Her defiance was both shocking and inspiring. A statement that love and loyalty mattered more than comfort or tradition. Together, they traveled deep into New Mexico territory, finding a hidden valley that neither settlers nor military knew existed. There they built a small homestead with their own hands, stone by stone, beam by beam. For the first time in his life, Tokala worked in broad daylight without hiding. His skin burned under the harsh sun, but he didn't care anymore. He was done hiding. They faced brutal winters where food was scarce and cold bit through every layer. They fought off predators drawn to their livestock. Bounty hunters occasionally found their valley, drawn by rumors of the giant Apache. And Tokala had to defend their home with his wolves at his side. But every challenge made them stronger, more united, more certain they'd made the right choice. During a snowstorm that raged for 3 days, trapped in their cabin with only firelight and each other, Nalin told him she was pregnant. Tokala felt terror grip his chest, fear that his child might inherit his curse, might be born with deformities or unnatural size that would make life as hard for them as it had been for him. But Nalin placed his huge, scarred hand on her belly and spoke with absolute certainty. This child wouldn't be a curse. It would be a bridge between worlds just like him. Their daughter was born healthy and perfect, neither gigantic nor scarred, but carrying strength in her small frame that suggested her father's blood ran true. They named her Kimimela, which meant butterfly, because she represented transformation and beauty emerging from struggle. 1 year and 1 day after their exile began, exactly as the elders had dictated, Tokala and Nalin returned to Chiricahua territory with Kimimela in their arms. They expected hostility, rejection, perhaps even violence. Instead, they found devastation. During their absence, the Bluecoats had intensified their campaign. The clan had been forced deeper into the mountains. Disease and hunger had decimated their numbers. Many of the elders who had banished Tokala were dead or too weak to lead. The people who remained looked defeated, hopeless, waiting for the final blow that would scatter them forever. And then, exactly as Nalin had foreseen in her visions, came the ultimate test. A massive military force arrived to pacify the remaining Apache once and for all. Hundreds of soldiers surrounded the camps, artillery positioned on ridges, cavalry ready to charge. Surrender seemed inevitable. Tokala stood up, not hunched, not hiding, not apologizing for his existence. He walked directly toward the military lines with Nalin at his side, their daughter on her hip. His voice, that deep rumbling sound that had always frightened people, now carried across the canyon so even distant soldiers could hear. He asked if they wanted war, because if so, they would fight him first. But if they would accept peace, he guaranteed his people would remain in these mountains in exchange for permanent ceasefire. The military commander was a reasonable man, exhausted by years of frontier warfare. Looking at Tokala, he saw not a monster, but a desperate leader trying to save his people. More importantly, rumors of Tokala's ferocity had spread throughout the territory. The story of his raid on Magnus Eriksson's ranch had become legend, embellished with each retelling until some soldiers believed the giant Apache could tear men apart with his bare hands. No one wanted to test those rumors in actual combat. Negotiations began. Tokala, with intelligence people had always underestimated, and Nalin beside him translating political nuances, achieved something that seemed impossible. A legitimate treaty guaranteeing the Chiricahua clan rights to mountain land in exchange for peace. It wasn't everything, wasn't even close to what had been taken, but it was survival. It was a future. The years that followed transformed Tokala from outcast to legend. He became the intermediary between his people and settlers, his intimidating appearance now an advantage in negotiations. No one dared cheat the mountain giant, and both sides began to trust that he would deal fairly. He was uniquely positioned to understand both worlds, to speak both languages not just of tongue, but of culture, to bridge gaps that seemed unbridgeable. Nalin was recognized as a seer and spiritual leader, helping preserve traditions while navigating the realities of this new world forming around them. Kimimela grew strong and healthy, showing both her father's strength and her mother's grace. But more importantly, she possessed a gift for seeing people as simply people, without the divisions that plagued older generations. She played with Apache and settler children with equal ease, becoming a living symbol of the bridge Nalin had prophesied. But peace never comes easily or permanently. There are always those who prefer the old hatreds, who profit from conflict, who can't imagine a world where different people coexist. Silas Vance, who had survived Tokala's raid and spent years nursing his hatred, organized a group of radical settlers planning a false flag massacre. They would slaughter some of their own people and blame the Apache, shattering the fragile peace and reigniting war. But Tokala wasn't alone anymore. He had allies now, soldiers who respected his word, traders who depended on peace, and his own people who finally accepted him not despite his differences but because of them. When Vance's group tried to execute their plan, they were caught in the act by a combined force of federal soldiers and Apache warriors working together, a sight that would have been impossible just years before. Facing the gallows for his crimes, Vance spat at Tokala one last time, calling him a monster, saying he always would be. Tokala, holding Kimimela's hand, simply replied that maybe he was a monster, but he was one who chose to protect instead of destroy. What did that make Vance? Hey, quick pause here, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Leave a comment telling me your location. It's always amazing to see this community from all over the world. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Your support means everything and helps me continue telling stories that matter. Years later, at a celebration of peace between Apache clans and local settlers, an event unthinkable a generation before, Tokala and Nalin danced once more beneath the stars. They were older now, grayed and weathered by hard living, but still strong, still together. Their cabin in the hidden valley had expanded into a small community where Apache and settlers learned to live side by side, not without friction, but with respect and growing understanding. Kimimela, grown now with children of her own, watched her parents dance and smiled. She had become a teacher, instructing children in both Apache traditions and English language, building bridges her father had started with his simple refusal to remain hidden. She taught that strength came in many forms, that monsters were made by choices, not appearances, that the things that make us different are often the things that make us valuable. As the music played and the fire crackled, Tokala realized something profound. He hadn't been redeemed despite his scars and monstrous appearance. He had been redeemed because of them, because those very things taught him empathy, forced him to choose kindness over violence, made him capable of seeing other rejected souls and extending his hand. His suffering had made him more human, not less. In the darkness of surrounding mountains, his old wolves still howled, no longer solitary but in chorus, a sound echoing through canyons like a song of triumph. The monster everyone feared had become the guardian everyone needed. And in the end, Tokala understood the greatest truth of all. Monsters aren't born from the scars we carry on our skin, but from the choices we make with the pain in our hearts. He had chosen to protect rather than destroy, to build rather than tear down, to love despite every reason not to. The fire burned low as night deepened, and Tokala held Nalin close, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, watching their grandchildren play in the firelight without fear. Everything he had endured, every moment of pain and isolation and rejection, had led to this. Not to being saved or fixed or made normal, but to being seen, accepted, loved for exactly what he was. Nalin had taken his hand when everyone else turned away, and that single act of courage had changed not just his life, but the future of all their people. The story of the giant Apache and the woman who saw him would be told for generations, evolving into legend, teaching children that the bravest act isn't vanquishing monsters but recognizing the humanity in those society deems monstrous. That redemption isn't about becoming something different, but about being something better. That the greatest warriors are sometimes those who choose peace over violence, understanding over hatred, bridge building over wall building. As stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance and the desert wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, Tokala closed his eyes and felt something he'd never thought possible. He felt at peace, not because the world had changed to accommodate him, but because he had changed himself to meet the world with courage rather than fear, with open hands rather than closed fists. The child born under the blood moon, marked by tragedy and trauma, had become exactly what the elders unknowingly prophesied. Not a destroyer, but a protector. Not a curse, but a blessing. Not a monster, but a man who understood that humanity isn't defined by how we look, but by how we choose to live.